Okay, today's lesson is going to take a look at linear equations specifically, but in general we're going to be looking at slope today. So this is lesson 2.1 and it says we'll be looking at slope. Before we do that, let's practice a key skill for module 1A, which is evaluating fractions. So when you're doing that, just remember from that first unit, you're going to work out the top of the fraction, the numerator, you're going to work out the bottom of the fraction, the denominator, and then you're going to divide your answer. Click the next slide to start the warm-up. And as you go through each one, you'll see all 6 questions here together. And you're just going to answer each one as you go. You might need to scroll down a little bit. We can't quite fit in all the answers there. 6 answers to go with the 6 questions. So just to do number 1 with you, just to make sure you understand what's going to happen here. 7 minus 3 is 4. I would make a note of that. 3 minus 1 is 2. And then 4 divided by 2 is 2. So I would scroll down and then find the one that has the correct answer, and then I can just select that, and then I can move on to the next question. Now, as you're doing some of these as well, they might not always be whole numbers. In fact, you can see some of these are fractions. The clue, write in simplest form. So, for example, the one that says 1/4 here, you might actually end up with something like 10/40. And if you divide both by 10, you'd get 1/4. So if you end up with a fraction, but you don't see it in this answer choice, just make sure that you continue to simplify every single part. So just click through, do slide 2. Like I say, it's going to be the same picture, but just make sure, just make sure that you pick the right question from the screen. Question 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then the end of the warm-up there as well. Now, for some people who did finish quickly, I did ask them these 2 questions, because often people get these 2 mixed up. So if you type 0 divided by 1 on your calculator, it will actually say 0. But if you type 1 divided by 0 on your calculator, it'll actually say error. You might see the little E in the corner of your calculator, depending on what type of calculator you're using. And that's going to be a special case that we're going to talk about later. Some people know things like infinity, or some people say undefined, or they remember it perhaps from middle school, perhaps as well. Just a little fact here, when we talk about slope, we use the letter M, and it comes from the French word for mountain, which is montagne. So when we're looking at slopes, we often use the letter M, and that's something we'll talk about in future lessons a little bit more. So some of this stuff should be partially familiar to you, depending on what you managed to cover last year. So when we find slope, basically what we're looking at is how steep is a line. And there's 2 different ways we can do it. We can either do it from a graph, or we can do it from coordinates. And there's 2 formulas that we need to learn to actually do that. There is a formula sheet on the Algebra 1 SOL, but that's not one. Then these 2 formulas are not on there. So these are 2 that you need to learn. So for slope, it's rise over run. Rise means how much you go up. Run might not be obvious, but it's to the right. Notice it begins with an R as well, so you can use that to figure it out. So whenever we have 2 points, and there's 2 points plotted here, kind of like reading a book, start from the left. So start from this point here. Figure out how many squares you need to go up. I've done little arrows so you can see, until you're level with this point here. So I counted up 8 squares. Count how many squares you go to the right, 4 squares. And then by doing rise over run, 8 divided by 4 is 2. As you get more practice on doing questions like this, you'll actually know that you can do this any way you like on the line. I could have actually started here and done the question. So from here, I could go up 2 squares, go across 1 square, and 2 divided by 1 is also 2. Or I could do it here. I could go up 2 and across 1 just to get back to the line, which is also 2. Or from here, I could go up 6 across 3, and 6 divided by 3 is 2. So there's several different ways that we can actually count the slope. But in general, you'd want to count how many squares you go up, how many squares you go across from one point to the other point. Now, if you're given coordinates, and actually these 2 points here are the same question, -1, -3, -1 on the x-axis, and then level with -3 on the y-axis, and my other coordinate, 3 from the x-axis and 5 from the y-axis. So just so you realize this is the same question. If we don't have graph paper though, it's going to be very, very inconvenient to do this, so we want a more algebraic method. So it's important we label coordinates. So the first coordinate is always the x, and the second one is always the y. So for this first coordinate, I call it x1, y1. And then for the second coordinate, I call it x2, y2. So same order, x and y, but just the 2 to show it's the second coordinate. When we're doing that with coordinates, we write down the formula, y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. One thing to try and help you remember this, remember the rise over run part. The rise refers to how much you go up, and if you can see here, that's actually the y-axis as well. Sometimes people get these the wrong way around. They put x2 minus x1. Substitute in the numbers. So look what y2 is. So basically just look up 5. So in the same space, put 5 on your formula. Take away y1, just look what's above y1, negative 3. They put parentheses here just to make sure that we don't get confused. x2 is 3, so we put 3 in the bottom left. x1 is in the bottom right, and x1 it says is negative 1, so fill that in here. And this is basically what you were just doing in your warm-up, and that was the whole point of the warm-up. If you know how to simplify a fraction, then the only part you need to know for slope is where do the correct numbers go. And as long as you get them in the right order, you should be able to get the right answer each time. So work out the top, 8, work out the bottom, 4, and then go ahead and divide, and that will give you that same answer that we just saw a second ago as well. Be careful with negative numbers. It might be one way you want to use a calculator just to make sure you get it correct. And then at this point, there's 4 questions for you to try. As you're doing the questions, you should write x1, y1, x2, y2 underneath, just to make sure that you put them in the correct place. And then as you've done that, you're going to put your answer here. And for people who did this live with me, you can actually share some of your answers with the class, so you could see if you were getting a similar answer, and we can compare answers. As you click on the next slide, you do the same for number 2. You do the same for number 3. And you do the same for number 4. The last 2 ones, actually, we didn't share answers with. I just got you to type them in to see exactly what happens. Number 4, as you get to that one, it's one of those special ones we talked about earlier. It will either be something divided by 0, or it'll either be 0 divided by something. So just keep an eye out for that one. This one just says, just wait a second. If people who finish quickly, just give other people a chance to catch up a little bit. So we're going to keep on going. So just to make sure people did at least get the numbers in the correct place, I did put this here so you can check that part. That doesn't give the final answers, but if you're getting to here, then you should be okay. I added extra parentheses here on the top for people who type everything in all in one go on the calculator, just to make sure we get it correct. But you don't have to put that many parentheses in if you don't wish. Now, having figured out how to find slope by either counting squares or by looking at the coordinates and using that formula, we do need to identify certain types of slope. So slopes can be positive or negative. So positives are ones like this one on the left, where they go up from bottom left to top right, and I've just drawn a little arrow there to show you that. And negative slopes are the ones that go downwards as you look from left to right. So top left to bottom right, that's your negative slope. Now, somebody did create this character called Mr. Slope Guy, who actually helps you to remember. If you can visualize this picture, it will actually help you to remember the difference between positive and negative, and also 2 other types of slopes that we're going to look at in a second. So positive slope here, you can see that this type of line is that same direction we talked about. But notice his I is a plus sign, which is the symbol for positive. So if we look at this side of the picture, that will help us to remember what positive slope actually looks like. And similarly for negative slope, the one that goes downwards from top left to bottom right, notice his eye is closed for this one, so it kind of looks like a negative sign as well. So we can use that to help us for figuring out positives and negative slopes. And we'll talk about his nose and his mouth in a second, but they're important too. Now, slopes don't just have to be whole numbers. We saw some fractional ones earlier, so just be aware that as we're counting squares, we can always go up, starting from the left, up 2, across 6, and then we could also simplify as well. If we have slopes that go downwards, we're not actually doing technically a rise. It actually goes down 4 places and then across 6 places. So to show it goes down, we give it a negative sign, and hopefully you'd recognize this as negative slope straight away just from the direction. And we have some special slopes as well, horizontal and vertical. So vertical slopes, ones that look like this, the way we try and remember those ones is we often use the words hoy and vux. So the H in hoy stands for a horizontal line, as you can see here. This is actually not the letter O, it's actually a 0. And when we talk about equations in a future lesson, we'll talk about how the equation starts with y equals just a number, as you can see here. For vertical equations, we try and use the word vux, V for vertical. U is undefined. So that question earlier when we divided by 0, that's going to be an undefined slope. And when we do equations later, we'll call it x equals a specific number. So when we see horizontal and vertical lines, we can think of Hoy and Vux, and it will help us to remember, is it 0 or is it undefined? And you can also see those on Mr. Slope Guy as well. So his mouth, the one that was a horizontal line, his dimples are actually representing the 0 here. And for the vertical line, which was his nose, we kind of have a letter U here, so that reminds you that it's undefined. Another trick that somebody helped me once with, they said undefined also is up and down, because it starts with a U and ends in a D, and this line certainly goes up and down. So that might be another way you can possibly remember that as well. And then there's a summary of all the 4 things that we can use from the picture. There's your positive slope because of his eye, negative slope, there's 0 slope horizontally because of the 0, and the vertical line is U for undefined, and we can certainly use those to help us as well. Now, just to practice that idea of counting slope, because I've only done demonstrations so far here, there's a picture with some dots here. So what we're going to do is we're just going to count the squares. So I go up 1, 2, 3, 4. So in the top box it says put the rise. So here you would put 4. Counting from here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So in the middle box put the run. So I went 8 squares to the right. And in the last box, put the slope, so 4 divided by 8. I would prefer 1/2 over 0.5, but certainly some people did put decimals. The 1/2 is more useful because it actually relates to the picture. If you go up 1 square and across 2 squares, you get back to the line. So we try to use fractions when we're doing these questions. Horizontal line, we could actually just use that Hoy straight away, or we could go back to Mr. Slope Guy. So when we see a horizontal slope, we know immediately it's going to be 0. If we do count the squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 is the run. How many squares do you go up? Well, actually, you don't need to go up any at all because it's already in the same place. So up 0, across 7, and 0 divided by 7 would be 0. You can do the same thing on question 3, count the squares. Question 4, you could look back once you recognize it's a vertical line, or you could do it by counting the squares. How many does it go up? And actually, this one, there's no run. Once you go up, you're already on that same point, so you wouldn't actually need to do that anymore. That concludes the lesson for slope. There is an assignment that goes with this as well, so go look that one out. But for right now, that will do it for this example.